Welcome to the Sharing the Faith podcast, where every other week we explore the beauty and power of faith in Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Now here is your host, Dr. Tom Neal.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to have you with me again. Dr. Tom Neal here at the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee's headquarters with another episode of Sharing the Faith. And I'm really grateful today to have a dear friend of mine and my wife's, Dr. Susie Veters, who lives in New Orleans. We have known each other since 2012, and we're going to talk something about our own friendship and collaborative relationship in ministry and work. And his friends. But this is Dr. Susie Veters. So before I introduce you, Dr. Susie, good afternoon. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's awesome. And we coordinated our colors without knowing it. That's really cool. Very impressive. So let me tell you about Dr. Susie a little bit here about her from her bio. Dr. Susie Veters graduated from LSU in an undisclosed date with a BS in accounting and worked for many years as a CPA in public accounting, as well as for nonprofits and corporate entities. In 2000, Dr. Susie felt a tug in ministry towards the church and began studies at Notre Dame Seminary. She obtained a Master of Arts in Theological Studies from Notre Dame in 2003 and graduated summa cum laude. In 2018, she obtained her Doctor of Ministry degree from the Oblate School of Theology, which is in Austin, Texas, with a concentration in pastoral leadership. She previously worked for Notre Dame Seminary as the director of the Institute of Lay Ecclesial Ministry, which I had the privilege of working with her in for a period of time at least, as well as the director of stewardship and parish services for the Catholic Community Foundation for the Archdiocese of New Orleans. She works now, among other things in her ministry and life, as an adjunct instructor of lay ministry at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans. And she also serves at St. Clement of Rome Parish in Metairie as an advisor and consultant. She'll tell us a little bit about that a little bit more. Susie and her husband, Pat, who is a riot, been married for, is it 39 years?
It'll be 39 in June.
39 years in June, which, as I said before the show, they were actually married in infancy,
yes,
in a prearranged
definitely.
marriage. So you can see Susie clearly is not more than 40 years old. And they are actively involved in St. Pius X Catholic Church in New Orleans, have 3 grown sons and a grandchild. I'm sure she'll tell us more about that. So Dr. Susie, so good to have you. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about yourself beyond that you might want our listeners to hear about before we jump into the topic today?
Well, it's interesting. My journey of faith, I think more than anything, has been a journey to fix myself. And in I would say my 30s, I really felt like, and I know this is the Holy Spirit because nobody actually said this to me, but I felt like the answers were in the church. And when I say fix myself, obviously I'm talking about my own neurotic tendencies, my anxiety, my tendency to look at things worst case. Actually, my son and I, who has a similar temperament to me, we always say we're binary thinkers. Everything's just either awesome or it's like tragic and the world ends. And so my attempts to try to temper that and to help me just be more of a peaceful, joyful person all the time, I guess really began my search in faith, which has led me through ministry. So just to say a few more things than what you so kindly shared, after I finished my degree at Notre Dame Seminary, I really felt like I was being called to be a counselor or therapist. And so I started the counseling program at a local Catholic college. And so this was in the early 2000s. So really, there wasn't an openness at all to spirituality in counseling at that point. And so I got about 3 semesters into it, and I just felt like it wasn't the answer because we can't take God out of the healing process. Now, obviously, for if any of your listeners are licensed therapists or counselors. I know that there's an ethical line to walk, but I'm just talking about from my own perspective, in my own life. I knew that therapy, counseling, psychology wasn't going to get me the answers that I wanted. And so I just sort of turned my back on that. And over the years got more involved in the church, which of course led me to be director of the Institute of Lay Ecclesial Ministry, along with you. We worked together on that. And so as a part of that, I decided to get my doctorate so that I could have the appropriate credentials to teach in that program. So it just led me further and further into ministry. But just recently, I found a wonderful program that's a Catholic psychology institution called Divine Mercy University. And so I've been taking some classes there. We'll see if I end up finishing the degree. But it's really helped me to see, I think, how the intersection of the human experience and faith can be articulated in a much more powerful way. Because everything that's true is Catholic, right? We know that. But for those who are searching, a lot of times it depends on how we approach things and the terminology we use and the references we use that may either lead them further into their faith or perhaps take a dangerously wrong turn.
Yes. No, that's right. And I think one of the things, Susie, that you do so well and that I have benefited from, not only just knowing you, but also working with you and doing workshops together with you, is the way that you love to bring faith and science together, particularly faith and the psychological and social sciences together, and how much they can mutually enrich each other in helping to promote human flourishing that can then therefore promote good leadership, virtuous leadership in people. And one of the things that you and I did together is combining kind of a theology of the spiritual life and vocation with Strengths Finder, which is a particular program maybe you can comment a little on, as to how you bring about this integration of these two worlds that you saw, tended to be separated from each other, but really belong together.
Right. Well, so Strengths, actually, it used to be called Strengths Finder. Now it's called Clifton Strengths, is a tool of the Gallup organization. And of course, when we hear the word Gallup, we think about polls. So Gallup is an organization that's interested in data. And so years ago, they created this program. It's actually an assessment. And I don't want to call it a personality assessment. It's more of a characteristic assessment. And it really grew out of an attempt to understand what characteristics are associated with strong leaders. And what they found through their research is that it's not particular characteristics. It's not like you have to be an extrovert, you have to be good in communication. It's not specific characteristics, but it's the fact that you use your innate characteristics to the best of your ability. And so when we operate out of our strengths and become the leader, the mother, the wife, the coworker that God created me to be, specifically me in the way that he designed me, it's in that way that I become like the best version of myself. And so, I fell into this really through my ministry with stewardship. We were looking for a program to help parishes match people with ministries in a parish based on their strengths. And so I just found it to be a really helpful tool for helping people understand more about themselves.
It's true. And whenever we did that together and people would do the assessment, the tests that kind of gave them a sense of what their strengths were, and then how to rank those and relate them to other strengths, it was amazing to watch how much people came alive with that understanding. It was like looking at themselves in a mirror they had never seen before and appreciating things that they could do well, but also things that they always struggle with, and right. Appreciating that they shouldn't beat themselves up.
Right. Yeah, it's really important to understand what we're good at. And, it's interesting because part of the workshop I've developed has a segment in which you look at your strengths and you consider all the ways that they could be viewed through a negative lens. So like the labels people would put on you. And in many cases, people can relate more to that because they've always just been taught or had the tendency to put negative labels on themselves. And so a lot of times it's helping people to see themselves in a new way, not through that negative lens, because there is a bias to negativity in the human condition, unfortunately, particularly when we look at ourselves. So, yeah, it's a really affirming tool, and I have found it very helpful in faith conversations and leadership conversations.
And leadership, both, right? Both
Right.
leadership conversations and faith. And then the whole idea of virtuous leadership. I'd like to talk about another concept, and this is really the focus of what I'd like to get into today, is this idea of human flourishing. You talked about, the best version of ourselves. But this idea of human flourishing, which you've spent a lot of time thinking about in your studies at Divine Mercy University, what is human flourishing and how does one accomplish it, or how does one move towards human flourishing? So maybe share insights on what that means, human flourishing, and then what you've learned from your studies about, how one treads the path toward that.
Okay, I'm going to read a definition because it really helps me to pull apart. And this comes from one of the textbooks that Divine Mercy uses. And you'll see it's a very thick book.
Oh, yes.
You probably it's not nighttime reading, but it's a Catholic
What's
Christian.
the name of the author?
It's an edited book.
Oh, edited, got it.
Vitz, Nordling, and Titus are the three editors, but it's a Catholic Christian meta model of the person, integration with psychology and mental health practice. So what this book does is it looks at the theological and Catholic philosophical understanding of the human person in terms of just emotional life and the bonds we make with people through relationships, those types of things, and looks at how humans are put together through God's eyes. And so it lends a different conversation to what human flourishing means, right? Because psychology certainly took a wrong turn from the beginning, in that it was ordered to just self-fulfillment. But really, humans are made to be holy, not to fulfill themselves. And so understanding that it does change the conversation. And also for psychology, it changes therapeutic methods in some cases, may hopefully change the conversation. But this is just the definition of human flourishing. Human persons are called to flourishing, that is perfection and holiness, through the interpersonal accepting and giving of love. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Although perfect flourishing is reserved for heaven, human persons are called at present to flourish in the integrity of the person, and that means psychological, moral, and spiritual levels, as well as the integrity of a relationship with God and neighbor. And in particular, this is very important, I think. This includes the distinct relationships related to one's vocational state in life and the application of virtues needed for that state. And so even though that is actually in parentheses at the end of the paragraph, I think that's the most important sentence or phrase rather, because when we order ourselves toward the relationships of our vocational state in life and the application of the virtues needed for that state, that's what brings us to human flourishing.
Absolutely. And that last concept you brought out there, which you've spoken about so much, which is the importance of vocation, understanding what vocation is, and then how one discovers and lives that out and then leads to vocation. I think that's the area I think that you have the most to contribute on. So maybe you could comment more on that idea of vocation, how it relates to human flourishing.
Right. Well, of course, I got my knowledge of even the language of Catholic vocation through Dr. Tom Neal. He really opened my mind to seeing life through a different way. So we understand our vocation. And of course, in Catholic circles, when we hear the word vocation, we most typically think about vocation to the priesthood and religious life. That's what we pray for in our special intentions. But yet every single human being born on this earth has a particular vocation that's very different and distinct from any other person. And so our vocation has several levels. Vocation to priesthood, religious life would just indicate really just one level, one distinction. But our vocation at the very basic level is our vocation as a Christian, our vocation to know and love God and to become holy. Our second vocation is our state in life, which is usually something that's fixed for most people. Obviously, things can change in that area, but outside of our holiness, our quest for holiness, it really is our vocation, our second level of vocation, our state in life that should get the most attention. And then the third level of vocation is our work, our community, our work in the community, our extended family and friends, and all those other things that pull on our time and effort. And so when you keep things ordered and you make decisions first based on your relationship with God, second on your relationship with those people within the state of within your state in life, and then of course those people that you work with and serve and are friends with, it helps you to discern life in an ordered way that keeps priorities straight.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And keeping priorities straight is really an expression of virtue, the virtues that help one order that. And again, we've talked a lot about this, about virtue and psychological flourishing, mental well-being, and just general kind of human flourishing. So talk about what you've learned about virtue in the psychological sciences and how those interrelate toward this idea of human flourishing.
Right. So, the four human or cardinal virtues, which of course, cardinal, I believe, means hinge. So these are the virtues that all other virtues hinge on, are prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. So those are big words, right, that don't necessarily seem like they have any implication in my life. But when you take those words and you filter them through the lens of your vocation, particularly your state in life, it makes it very specific. So let's just take justice. So what do we think of? What does the world think of when you hear the word justice? What would you say?
The courtroom.
Yes. Just making sure people get the right punishment. Basically, yep. I think that people pay their dues for the bad that they've done. But really, what justice means is giving someone what they're due, what they're owed. And this is, I guess, in the context of being a child of God. And so if you think of justice, say you're a person that has small children, if you're praying specifically about justice or trying to be a more just person, it may be that you should be spending more time with your kids. It may be that you need to work on your temper and the way that you treat your children or the way that you speak to your spouse. And so justice in that context is very different than it would be in the context of the way the secular world defines it. And of course, we could go through each, I don't know if we have time to do that, but each of the human virtues, when they're guided by your vocation, then they become very personal and specific. And I think that we're able to discern in a clearer way what it is that God's calling us to do or to change or to abstain from.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we could talk more about the individual virtues because there's so many applications of them, but thinking about the importance of understanding what they are and then how to cultivate them, how to grow them in your life and how to orient them toward what your vocation demands of you or asks of you. Thinking about that, what do you imagine when you think of cultivating virtue in one's life appropriately? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, gosh, it's so hard to say because we all have different levels of time that we can commit to understanding our faith. I think it's very important to continue to educate yourself on what the faith teaches. So many of the adults that I interact with, and I'm sure you too, when they start to understand like the deepness and the richness of the Catholic Church, the one comment I hear more than any is, how come I never heard this? Why wasn't I taught this? I think sometimes we hear things when we're in second grade communion preparation that, don't necessarily translate to our adult selves. So now that we're adults and we're ready to hear an adult version of the faith, where do we get it? Obviously, we get so much from the sacraments, and God's grace can fill all the holes that our wisdom or our knowledge doesn't have. But yet I think we're called to learn about our faith. And so what does that mean to each person? I think that only each person can discern the amount of time that they're willing or able to spend to learn more about their faith. But I just think that it's really important to understand what our faith teaches, and then also to cultivate a prayer life, because at the end of the day, it's God that's guiding us. Grace and the Holy Spirit, the intercession of saints that help lead us to the things that we need to read, that we need to know, that we need to watch, the people that will help us to develop our faith and grow in virtue. I always say that, well, the word I use is Jesus friends. We need Jesus friends. We need people that we can share our faith with. And when I meet particularly young women who ask me they don't have time to pray, they don't have time to be too involved in faith related activities, I just say, pray for Jesus friends. Because if you surround yourself by people that share that kind of desire to learn more about God, then you teach each other and you become interested in the same things. And so maybe a mom's morning out or, a coffee will turn into a faith sharing group so that you can juggle more and make faith more a part of your life.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And thinking about the contemporary context, so this idea of seeking out a community of people that will support your quest for growing in virtue or growing in holiness, to be a better human being, to discover your vocation. But thinking about the obstacles that exist in culture, we talked about this the other day about obviously hyper materialist culture, consumerist culture. I mean, just there's a lot of elements of culture that make pursuing virtue and in a faith context tough. So when you in your studies, when you're thinking about our culture and where the elements of resistance are or challenges we face and how our faith can give us resources to kind of respond to those, what areas would you say in culture you see, thinking about what you've learned, are most challenging out there for human flourishing to kind of grow?
Gosh, there's so many. I definitely think materialism is the number one pull for most of the people I see. And there's so many levels of that, right? It can push the need to put work at the top of your focus as above your family. Or it can just guide what you're obsessed about. Obviously, when you live your life through Instagram, a lot of times people want to present a certain version of themselves that's based on their materialistic surroundings. And, just think about the amount of energy that takes. It's funny. I always like to say this when I'm giving talks to women. My mother, used to say she was so glad that she raised children when she did, because she didn't have to work out, because that wasn't a thing when she was a young mother. And so we used to ask, me and my siblings would ask her to watch our kids so that we could go work out, and she would always make that. But, I think about that now, and we have this culture, this Instagram culture. The organization one is particularly funny, I think, where pantries and closets. And it's great to have an organized. I wish I had more of that kind of discipline. But what's asked of particularly our young parents, I think, is just overwhelming, to be perfect in all these ways and to have all these possessions that I guess point in the world's eyes to being perfect.
Sure, of course. No, that's very true. It's the superficiality of that culture stifles any, not only growth but just self-reflection, going any deeper into yourself, and the kind of things you need to do to grow in this case in virtue. So thinking about your own life, Susie, I know your studies have benefited you personally so much. Your theological studies, your pastoral studies, your and your passion for teaching, by the way, as well. But how have these psychological studies, working with StrengthsFinder or Clifton Strengths, how have those helped you? What benefited you, helped you to grow in your own Christian life and as a mother, as a wife, as a professional?
So two things come off the top of my head. And number one is really not necessarily just through the strengths work, but through an appreciation of what I can do well. Because I think particularly for women, we're just raised looking at what's wrong with us. And so when that is set in you in your 20s, it's really hard to break that. And so I think trying to just be open to the fact that I did do some things well, and perhaps I should allow myself to be complimented, or allow myself to give myself a pat on the back now and then, as opposed to what I used to do, which was always looking at the negative aspects of myself. So I would say that was number one. And the second I would say is the discernment of emotions. And, it's funny. I think that St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Ignatius were really the first two psychologists, because they both talked a lot about emotions in a different context. But St. Ignatius particularly developed this whole idea of discernment of spirits. And of course, when he talks about spirits, it's not like his focus is on evil spirits. I mean, obviously there's a very real element of that, but the way I've come to understand it, it's the spirit's not of God. So if it's not from God, then it's from our fallen selves, it's from the world, or it's from evil. And so St. Ignatius takes you through an exercise that helps you understand how to discern those spirits. But I think so often they occur in our emotions. And emotions is obviously separate from the intellect, but it's very much interwoven. And so for us to be able to step back and really understand where an emotion is coming from, and whether it's something that we need to try to dismiss or react out of. And, I think this is where the development of virtue comes from. Because if you're a person, for instance, a lot of people tend to always associate a negative intention to another person's remark. That becomes a habit where they perceive that somebody's slighting them or saying something negative, when in fact that was the furthest thing from the mind of the person who was making the comment. I think that's something that you really can work on, that God can help you to overcome over time. And so just looking at our emotional life and trying to discern what's real and what's not, it really has helped me. I mean, obviously I'm still working on it, but
just that insight alone is just so liberating, because it helps you right away. You see things differently, even if you still experience them and still struggle. It gives you an insight. And again, these are things we've shared on so many times that I've benefited from reflecting with you on this. And this is, by the way, the Jesus Friends thing, having you and my friendship over these years as someone that I can think through things like this with, talk about very freely and openly. It helps you go deeper, and those kind of friendships are just so important in life. I want to turn in the last 15 minutes to talk about human flourishing, growth in virtue as leaders, and your work with seminarians, because you worked a lot with men who are preparing for priesthood in the church. And so maybe however you want to share this, things you've enjoyed the most about your working with seminarians, helping them to grow as human beings, because your focus is really on what we call in the seminary world human formation, that basic formation. So maybe just things you'd like to share about that world of helping form great leaders for the church.
Well, I think human formation, I think it was John Paul II that said that human formation, I'm forgetting the words he used, but basically the foundation of all formation, because so the way that seminary formation is set up is that you're formed spiritually, pastorally, intellectually, and through the human lens. And so human formation is the way that we communicate all the other dimensions. Obviously, if you're very smart and you've learned a lot, but yet you come across in an aloof way, or you're somebody that talks down to people, well, it doesn't help that you know a lot about the Trinity or, some hard concepts. And so it's just really important that we always see things through that lens. And I think that, all of us have work to do, right? And so we just need to stay focused on that. And so anytime that I have an opportunity to work with the seminarians through StrengthsFinder, because that's one of the things that I do, or giving conferences, is always to try to remind them that it's through their human person that God will be communicated.
Yes.
So that's just number one.
That's right. And I think the emphasis you made earlier about your own insights into the importance of emotional or affective maturity, growing in your emotional life in seminarians, which I know that Pope John Paul II, in his writing on human formation, talks about the importance of affective maturity, that you have emotional intelligence.
Right.
And as you say, we've talked a lot about that too, emotional intelligence and human flourishing, and how important emotional intelligence is. So anyway, any comments you want to make on that? Because I always enjoy your insights into emotion.
So affective maturity is the word that's used in the formation documents. And I think it really means the same thing is emotional intelligence, which is the ability to read your own emotions, to understand them, and then to react appropriately. So it's not just in having emotions and naming them, but it's also being able to guide them. So if you're feeling angry, to do what you need to do to regroup, or if you're feeling embarrassed, to do what you need to do to go on, to make the choices in your next action. It needs to become an intuitive process. But it also, there needs to be an awareness that's open to the insight of other people. You have to be open to criticism. You have to be willing to ask people, how am I doing? What could I be doing better? I think that, one of the things that's challenging for the church, particularly for clergy, is that there's just not a mechanism built in for that kind of feedback.
Mm-hmm. There's into the church's leadership structure.
Yes,
I mean,
yes, because
that's true. Go ahead.
Because there's no annual evaluations necessarily. Now, maybe some dioceses do that. I don't know, but it's really on the backs of each man to make sure that they have created like a structure of relationships around them that are willing to hold them accountable. And for those of us who are married, we know that we have another person that holds us accountable.
Yes.
I just look at my husband and I's relationship. He holds me accountable when I'm overreacting, and I hold him accountable when he's talking too much or be in the life of the party too much. But, we both understand each other and can, and we know that each other, the good and the bad and the weak points. And so we're able to help steer each other. But unfortunately for a priest, it's not that one person, but it has to be the community that they're willing to build around them.
It really is. And that's a great point. And this kind of full circle here at the end, in the last 5 minutes or so, thinking about your Jesus friends, which, we are blessed to have in each other and many other people around us. The importance of relationships of accountability and encouragement that we have around us, friendships, for example, particularly, and the importance that has in human flourishing, in the pursuit of holiness, in living out one's vocation. You need other people around you. to keep you accountable. And so just, I guess, broadening this out at the end beyond priests or particular, us, or you or me, for people thinking about, if I want to pursue really the life of holiness and really experience human flourishing, and I want the relationships around me to serve that, to be part of that journey, what does that look like to have those healthy relationships in my life that help me walk that path?
Right. Well, obviously, we talked about the different levels of vocation. So your state in life, hopefully there are people in that level that can serve that purpose in your life, but we know that that's not always true. And so if you need more faith-filled people that can help guide you and walk with you in your journey, then I would say to get involved in your parish. Or in other ministries that are, they could be social service types of ministries that are supported by faith-based organizations. I think whenever you're involved with like-minded people that have the same interests, that it just automatically becomes a community of support. So it's hard to give blanket advice on that kind of thing, but I think we're surrounded by really good people.
We are, and I'll just say at the end, Dr. Susie and I, we worked together in the Institute for Lay Ecclesial Ministry. We'd have cohorts go through of maybe, 12, 15, 17, however many people in a cohort that would go through a 2-year formation process for commissioning, and then they'd go on maybe for a master's degree. But one of the things we found was it wasn't so much the courses they took or the workshops we did or the information we provided. In the end, it was the relationships that they were able to build in that environment, sharing a common sense of mission with each other. And maybe you could say a few comments on that at the end. Just, this is the gift that church brings us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think sometimes when you come together in a faith community, it's outside some of the challenges you may experience in your own family. And so it allows you to participate in a freer way that's maybe not entangled with other issues that might be going on. And also, there's something beautiful about just having a community thrust upon you, just like the apostles. When we choose our friends, we choose them usually all from the same race, the same socioeconomic circle, the same neighborhood, same types of jobs. But when you become a part of a faith community, it usually, not always, but in many cases, would give you the opportunity to come to love people that you may not, on face value, have chosen to be your friend.
That is such a great point, by the way. I love that. I love it so much. And I love, in relationship to that, the Catholic idea of a parish. Your parish is the place you live. It's your territory you're in. And it's the people that you haven't chosen, but there they are. The James Joyce, I always quote that James Joyce's book, Finnegan's Wake, where he says Catholic means here comes everybody. And you find yourself in that kind of group, and it can really shape you in ways that you never imagined. Speaking of that, I want to end just by saying something about Susie and her husband, Pat, just as a personal note here to share. When my wife, Patty, and I and our children moved to New Orleans in 2012, it was, we came from Iowa, very different world. And we didn't know anyone in New Orleans really at all, except for Dr. Chris Baglow, who had, kind of made the connection for the job for me. But anyway, we began down there. And the very first people to actually invite us into their world were Susie and Pat, who invited us out to dinner one night and just made us feel incredibly welcomed. And from then on, it grew that way, the two of them. They're the kind of people, I was talking to Patty last night, as I mentioned, to where I was going to have you on today, that when we're with you, we always leave feeling better than we came, lifted up. We've laughed a lot. We feel encouraged, grounded in reality. These are real people. Susie, when I first met her, said, if your kids are perfect, I can't be your friend. I was like, well, that's my line. So we just made a friendship because neither of our kids are perfect. But Susie, the last thing I'll say is Susie also she gave me so many opportunities when I was in New Orleans, opened doors for me, kind of step back and kind of let me, kind of step up to the plate in different areas of leadership and opportunities that I wouldn't have had. And I really appreciate, Susie, that so much about you. It's like, well, your strengths finder. You have this real natural ability to highlight others' gifts and let them shine, and then step back and let it happen without you being in the limelight. And I appreciate that so much about you. And love you. We love you guys so much, and appreciate all you've done for us and the people that you've blessed in New Orleans. So thank you so much for being on this podcast. I've so enjoyed this conversation. It felt like a coffee shop conversation with you, talking about a host of topics.
Well, it's been a pleasure, obviously, just to see you and to hear your voice, and think about the hours and hours and hours that we spent trying to fix the church.
We did. Well, it still hasn't happened, but we're not going to quit.
Right. But
we're not going to quit.
We're keep fixing each other ourselves, though, right?
That's it. That's in the end. Isn't that where we end up? Right. Yeah. That's the thing that needs to be repaired in the end.
Right.
Well, God bless you so much.
Thank you so much.
And
Patty.
I will pass that on to her, and the same to Pat, and look forward to the next time. And I'd like to thank all of our listeners and viewers today for joining us on Sharing the Faith. It's been wonderful to be with you. May the Lord bless you. In this month of Mary that I'm recording this, you won't be receiving this podcast in May, but may Our Lady intercede for you and all your intentions and bless you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Sharing the Faith podcast. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit ptdiocese.org/sharingthefaith. If you listen to the audio version through an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe, or leave a comment on the episode. Thank you for listening.